After his mom, who was a secret banker, died, Daniel Harper stood in the rain outside the funeral home, but his wife Jessica wasn't there to comfort him. She was at a hotel with his boss, Richard Caldwell, a powerful broker who'd been whispering promises of penthouses and private jets into her ears for months. The divorce papers arrived 3 days after the burial, but Jessica had no idea that the frail woman in the modest suburban house had been managing a $50 trillion global fund from her basement office, and Daniel had just inherited every cent of it. He watched from the shadows as Jessica paraded through Manhattan on Richard's arm, flashing the engagement ring that cost more than Daniel's yearly salary. But she didn't know her new lover was already making his first move against her ex-husband. When Richard used his connections to freeze Daniel's credit cards at a charity gala where Jessica stood beside him in a designer gown, expecting her former husband to be humiliated and destroyed. But what Daniel did next didn't just shock her. It shattered everything she thought she knew about power, money, and the quiet man she'd thrown away. Would Jessica discover the truth before Richard's empire crumbled? Would Daniel's revenge consume him or set him free? Could the secret his mother had hidden for 30 years finally be revealed without destroying them all? Daniel Harper had always believed his mother was ordinary, but the rain that fell on her casket told a different story. It fell like tears from a sky that knew secrets he'd never been allowed to learn. He stood alone at Greenwood Cemetery, watching the groundskeepers lower Margaret Harper into the earth. But his wife Jessica had sent a text message instead of showing up. "Can't make it. Important meeting. Sorry." The meeting, Daniel would learn 14 hours later, was happening in room 2847 of the Waldorf Astoria, but the only business being conducted involved his wife's lips on his boss's neck and her hands removing Richard Caldwell's Armani tie. Daniel discovered this truth not through detective work or suspicious behavior, but through a photograph sent anonymously to his phone. Jessica's face caught mid-laugh, her head thrown back, Richard's hand possessively gripping her waist, the hotel room visible in the mirror behind them. 3 days after Margaret Harper's funeral, a courier arrived at Daniel's apartment at 6:47 a.m., but the package didn't contain condolences or casseroles from concerned neighbors. The envelope was cream-colored and embossed with the logo of Whitmore and Associates, Manhattan's most ruthless divorce attorneys. But Daniel's hands didn't shake as he opened it, because some part of him had been expecting this moment since Jessica stopped saying "I love you" and started saying "Richard says." The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, but the attached note in Jessica's handwriting revealed the real reason. "You've been a good man, Daniel, but Richard offers me the life I deserve, a life you could never provide. Please don't make this difficult. J." Daniel sat in the kitchen of their apartment, soon to be her apartment, according to page 7, paragraph 3 of the legal document, but his mind wasn't processing the dissolution of his marriage. His thoughts kept circling back to his mother's funeral, to the strange men in expensive suits who'd stood at the back of the chapel, to the lawyer named Edmund Cross who'd approached him after the service and pressed a business card into his palm with words that made no sense. "Call me when you're ready to know the truth about Margaret." He called at 8:15 a.m., but Edmund Cross didn't answer with pleasantries or condolences. "Mr. Harper, I need you to come to my office immediately, alone. Tell no one where you're going. What I'm about to reveal will change your life, but it will also put you in danger if the wrong people discover what you've inherited." The offices of Cross and Meridian occupied the 73rd floor of a building Daniel had walked past 1,000 times, but never imagined entering. Edmund Cross was 67 years old with silver hair and eyes that had witnessed decades of secrets, but his handshake was firm and his voice was steady as he gestured Daniel toward a leather chair that probably cost more than Daniel's car. Your mother wasn't who you thought she was, Edmund began, but he didn't wait for Daniel to process this statement before continuing. Margaret Harper was born Margaret Vandross in Geneva, Switzerland. She wasn't a retired secretary. She was one of the most brilliant financial architects of the modern age, but she operated in absolute secrecy for 30 years. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, to defend his mother's memory against this stranger's delusions, but Edmund slid a folder across the mahogany desk. Inside were photographs. His mother, 40 years younger, standing beside men Daniel recognized from history books and news reports. His mother shaking hands with central bank governors. His mother at conferences in Zurich, Tokyo, Singapore. His mother in a sleek business suit that looked nothing like the floral dresses she'd worn to his school plays and baseball games. Your mother managed the Vandross Global Fund, Edmund continued, but his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. $50 trillion, Daniel. Assets accumulated and invested across every major market on Earth, but held in a structure so complex that most governments don't know it exists. She built it over decades, starting with inheritance money and turning it into something that could reshape global economies with a single transaction. The number was incomprehensible, but Daniel's voice worked enough to ask, why? Why would she live in that small house? Why would she drive that old Honda? Why would she let me work at Caldwell Investments for a salary that barely covered rent? Edmund's expression softened, but his answer cut deep. Because she was protecting you. The kind of money she controlled attracts dangerous attention, but she wanted you to have a normal life for as long as possible. She wanted you to learn to work, to struggle, to understand the value of things before you inherited the power to buy anything. She made me promise to wait until after her death to reveal the truth. But she also made me promise to teach you how to wield this inheritance responsibly. Daniel's hands were shaking now, but not from grief or shock, from anger. She let me struggle. She watched me take verbal abuse from Richard Caldwell. She watched Jessica grow resentful of our lifestyle. She could have helped, but she chose not to. She was testing you, Edmund said gently, but his eyes remained hard. And you passed. You remained honest. You didn't cut corners. You didn't steal. You didn't become bitter. She watched you, Daniel, and she saw that you had integrity. That's why you're receiving this inheritance, but that's also why you need to be careful about what you do with it. The lawyer pulled out another document, but this one was a death certificate with a coroner's note attached. Your mother's death wasn't from natural causes, Daniel. She was murdered. But the poison used was sophisticated enough that it appeared to be heart failure. I've had private investigators looking into this, but they've found connections to financial institutions that would lose significant power if the Vandross Fund's existence became public knowledge. Daniel's world tilted, but he gripped the arms of the chair until his knuckles turned white. Who killed her? We don't know yet, Edmund admitted, but his jaw clenched. What we do know is that someone has been trying to trace her assets for years, and they may have finally succeeded, which means you're in danger, Daniel, but you're also now the most powerful person in this room. The inheritance is yours. The fund is yours. Every asset, every connection, every resource your mother built is now under your control. Edmund pushed a black credit card across the desk, but it looked different from any card Daniel had ever seen. No bank name, no credit card company logo, just a series of numbers embossed in silver and a holographic strip that seemed to shift in the light. This is your primary access card. There's no limit, no restrictions, but every transaction is monitored by my firm to ensure your safety. Use it wisely, Daniel. Use it carefully. Your mother spent 30 years building this empire in secret, but you need to decide what kind of legacy you're going to create. Daniel left the office 3 hours later with documents he barely understood and a power he couldn't fully comprehend. But his phone buzzed before he reached the elevator. Jessica. Daniel, I need you to sign the divorce papers by Friday. Richard and I want to make this official. He's been so patient and I don't want to keep him waiting. I hope you understand. He understood perfectly, but what Jessica didn't understand was that the balance of power had shifted so dramatically that her new reality existed on a different planet. Daniel signed the divorce papers that evening, but he added a clause that his lawyer, now Edmund Cross, not the public defender he'd planned to hire, insisted upon. All previous shared accounts and assets remain with Daniel Harper. Jessica Winters receives no spousal support and relinquishes all claims to properties, investments, and future earnings. Jessica signed without reading it carefully because Richard had promised her a new life, but Daniel knew she was about to learn an expensive lesson about trust and greed. The engagement announcement appeared in the society pages 2 weeks later, but Daniel was already implementing the first phase of what he'd started calling the reckoning. Jessica Winters and Richard Caldwell were photographed at charity galas, restaurant openings, and Broadway premieres. But what they didn't know was that Daniel now controlled significant shares in every company Richard's brokerage firm represented. Richard Caldwell had built his career on aggressive tactics and insider connections, but his firm, Caldwell Investments, was leveraged to dangerous levels. Daniel had Edmund's team conduct a thorough audit, and what they discovered would have made the Securities and Exchange Commission salivate. Fraudulent trades, embezzled client funds, and a Ponzi scheme disguised as a hedge fund that had been operating for 7 years. But Daniel didn't call the authorities because revenge served cold was more satisfying than revenge served through bureaucratic channels. Instead, he waited for the perfect moment, the Whitmore Charity Gala, where Manhattan's elite gathered to pretend they cared about affordable housing, while sipping champagne that cost more per bottle than a month's rent in the neighborhoods they claimed to support. Jessica arrived in a crimson Valentino gown that Richard had purchased for her, but she wore it like armor as she walked through the ballroom at the Four Seasons. Richard's hand never left her waist, his smile never faltered, but his eyes scanned the room constantly, cataloging who mattered and who didn't. Daniel Harper, in Richard's estimation, fell firmly into the didn't matter category. Daniel arrived alone, but he wore a custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo that Edmund had insisted upon. "You need to look like you belong," the lawyer had said, but Daniel felt like an imposter even as he walked past security and into the glittering ballroom where crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across marble floors. He saw Jessica before she saw him, but the moment their eyes met, across the crowded room was electric. Shock flashed across her face, followed by confusion. What was Daniel doing at an event where tickets cost $5,000 per person? But then Richard whispered something in her ear, and her expression shifted to smug satisfaction. What happened next would be replayed in Manhattan social circles for months, but the truth of it would remain obscured because the real power moves happened behind the scenes. Richard Caldwell approached Daniel with Jessica on his arm, but his smile was predatory rather than friendly. "Harper, surprised to see you here. I didn't know you could afford the entrance fee on your salary. Oh, wait, you don't work for me anymore, do you? I had to let you go after the divorce. Conflict of interest, you understand." Daniel nodded slowly, but his voice remained calm. "I understand perfectly, Richard. I also understand you've been creative with your client accounts. Very creative." Richard's smile tightened, but Jessica's hand squeezed his arm, a gesture that said, "Ignore him, he's just bitter." "Careful, Harper. Defamation is expensive, and I have lawyers who would eat you alive." "As do I," Daniel replied, but he pulled out his phone and showed them a screenshot. It was Richard's personal credit card statement, but the numbers were shocking. $847,000 in charges over the past 3 months. But Richard's legitimate income couldn't possibly support that spending. I own significant shares in American Platinum Bank now. Fascinating what you can discover when you have access to financial records. Richard's face went pale, but he recovered quickly. That's private information. You can't. I can, Daniel interrupted, but his voice never rose above conversational volume. I can do many things now, Richard. I can do things that would terrify you if you understood the scope of my resources. But I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to offer you a choice. Jessica was watching this exchange with growing alarm, but she didn't yet understand that her world was balanced on a knife's edge. Daniel, what are you talking about? What resources? You're an analyst. You were barely making $70,000 a year when we were married. Was, Daniel confirmed, but he smiled for the first time. Past tense, Jessica. Things change. People change. Financial situations change dramatically when you inherit a $50 trillion global fund from your mother, who was a secret banker. The number hung in the air like a bomb, but neither Jessica nor Richard seemed able to process it. 50 trillion, not million, not billion, trillion. That's impossible, Richard finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. No one person controls that much wealth. It doesn't exist. It exists, Daniel said quietly, but Edmund Cross had appeared at his elbow, a ghost in an impeccable suit. My lawyer can provide documentation if you'd like, but I think we both know that would be unnecessary. What's necessary, Richard, is that you make a choice right now. You can resign from Caldwell Investments tonight, surrender your brokerage license, and disappear quietly. Or I can release the audit my team conducted on your firm, and you can spend the next 20 years in federal prison for fraud, embezzlement, and securities violations. Richard's jaw clenched, but his eyes darted to Jessica. This is insane. You're bluffing. I never bluff, Daniel replied, but then he did something that shocked everyone watching. He pulled out the black credit card Edmund had given him and handed it to a waiter. Please charge everything tonight to this card. Every auction item, every drink, every meal. I'm covering the entire gala. The waiter looked at the card skeptically, but when he swiped it through the payment system, the transaction went through instantly. $2.7 million. Approved without a single verification call. The room had gone quiet, but not because people had been listening to Daniel's conversation with Richard. The sound system had just announced that an anonymous donor had covered every expense for the evening, and the director of the Whitmore Foundation was on stage thanking a generous benefactor who wishes to remain unnamed. Jessica's face had gone white, but Daniel wasn't watching her anymore. He was watching Richard, who seemed to be calculating odds and consequences with the speed of a man who'd spent his career gaming systems. You can't freeze my credit cards, Richard said suddenly, but it was a statement born of defiance rather than confidence. I have accounts at 15 different banks. I have credit lines totaling $12 million. You can't. Daniel pulled out his phone again and made a single call, but he didn't identify himself. Execute Protocol 7. 30 seconds later, Richard's phone began buzzing, and buzzing, and buzzing. Text messages from every bank he'd ever used, every credit card company, every financial institution. Account frozen due to suspicious activity. Please contact customer service. Richard stared at his phone like it had become a venomous snake, but Jessica was looking at Daniel with an expression that mixed horror and dawning comprehension. How? How is this possible? My mother spent 30 years building a network that touches every major financial system on Earth, Daniel explained, but his voice held no triumph, only tired resignation. She did it in secret because she understood that this kind of power corrupts, but she also understood that someone needed to maintain balance. She chose me as her successor, but not before teaching me that wealth without purpose is just numbers on a screen. He turned to Jessica fully now, but his eyes held no anger, only sadness. You divorced me because I couldn't give you the life you wanted, because Richard promised you penthouses and private jets and a world where money solved every problem. But you never asked what I wanted, Jessica. You never asked what made me happy. You assumed I was content being mediocre, but the truth is I was content being honest. I was content working hard. I was content building a life with someone I loved, but you weren't. You wanted more, and Richard promised to give it to you. Jessica's eyes were filling with tears, but Daniel didn't stop. Now you're going to marry a man who built his empire on fraud, a man who embezzled millions from clients who trusted him, a man who's about to lose everything because he made the mistake of targeting me after my mother died. And you're going to lose everything too, Jessica, because you chose greed over loyalty. Daniel, Jessica started, but Richard interrupted her. What do you want? Richard demanded, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. Money? You clearly don't need it. Public humiliation. You're doing that right now. What's your endgame, Harper? Daniel considered the question, but Edmund Cross answered for him. Justice. The clients Richard embezzled from will receive full restitution by the end of the week. The Ponzi scheme will be dismantled and legitimate investors will recover their losses. Richard Caldwell will resign in disgrace, but he won't face criminal prosecution if he cooperates fully. And Jessica Winters will learn an expensive lesson about judging people by their bank accounts rather than their character. That's it, Richard asked, but he seemed suspicious of the relatively lenient terms. I resign, pay back the money, and walk away. With nothing, Daniel clarified. You'll walk away with nothing, Richard. No assets, no reputation, no future in finance. You'll spend the rest of your life knowing that you could have been honest, could have been legitimate, but you chose the easy path. And that path led you here, to this moment, where a man you considered beneath you just destroyed everything you built. Richard looked at Jessica, but she was still staring at Daniel. I'm sorry, she whispered, but the apology felt hollow. I didn't know. I didn't understand. You didn't ask, Daniel replied, but his voice was gentle. You saw what you wanted to see, Jessica. You saw a man who worked long hours for modest pay. You saw a husband who couldn't afford expensive restaurants or luxury vacations. But you never saw the man who came home to you every night, who loved you despite your complaints, who would have given you the world if you'd just been patient enough to let him inherit it properly. The gala continued around them, but the three of them stood frozen in a tableau of broken dreams and shattered illusions. Richard Caldwell would resign the following morning, and by evening, every major news outlet would be reporting on the collapse of Caldwell, investments, and the mysterious White Knight investor who'd ensured clients were made whole. Jessica would break off the engagement within a week, but Daniel would never know if she did it out of guilt or simply because Richard no longer had money. But that night, as Daniel walked out of the Four Seasons Hotel and into the cool Manhattan evening, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his mother's funeral. Peace. Not happiness. The grief of losing Margaret was still too raw, but a sense that he'd honored her memory by using the power she'd given him to correct an injustice rather than simply accumulate more wealth. Edmund Cross caught up with him on the sidewalk, but the lawyer was smiling. Your mother would be proud. She always said the true test of character was how someone wielded power when they had every reason to abuse it. What happens now? Daniel asked, but he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Now you decide what to do with 50 trillion, Edmund replied, but his tone was serious. Your mother had plans, investments in renewable energy, medical research, education initiatives in developing nations. She wanted to change the world quietly, without fanfare or ego. The question is whether you want to continue her work or chart your own course. Daniel thought about his mother in that basement office, managing incomprehensible sums of money while cooking him dinner and helping him with homework. He thought about the secret she'd kept for 30 years, the double life she'd lived, the sacrifices she'd made to protect him from the dangers that came with extreme wealth. "I want to continue her work," he said finally, but he added a caveat. "But I also want to find out who killed her. Someone poisoned her, Edmund. Someone murdered her to get to this money. I can't let that go unanswered." Edmund's expression darkened, but he nodded. "I've been conducting my own investigation, and I have leads. Dangerous leads that point to some of the most powerful financial institutions in the world. If we pursue this, Daniel, we'll be declaring war on organizations that have toppled governments and destroyed lives. Are you prepared for that?" Daniel looked back at the Four Seasons, at the glittering windows where Manhattan's elite were still celebrating their charitable contributions and social standing, but his mind was already made up. "My mother spent 30 years fighting these battles in secret. The least I can do is fight them openly with every resource she left me. Find the people who killed her, Edmund. Find them, and I'll make sure they face justice." The lawyer extended his hand, but his grip was firm. "Then we begin tomorrow. Tonight, go home and rest. You've had enough revelations for one evening." But Daniel didn't go home. Home was the apartment he'd shared with Jessica, now empty except for his clothes and books. Instead, he walked through Manhattan for hours, processing everything that had happened, everything that would happen, everything his life had become. 3 weeks later, the investigation into Margaret Harper's death led to a mid-level executive at Consolidated Global Banking named Trevor Morrison. But Trevor was just a foot soldier following orders from higher up the chain. Edmund's investigators tracked the orders to a secretive investment consortium called the Basel Group. But the Basel Group didn't officially exist. No corporate registration, no public membership, no paper trail except for encrypted communications that took months to decrypt. What they discovered was a conspiracy that stretched back decades. A group of banking executives who'd learned about the Vandross Fund and spent years trying to locate it, control it, or destroy it. Margaret had evaded them for 30 years through misdirection and false trails, but 6 months before her death, someone had gotten close. Too close. The poison was administered at a charity luncheon where Margaret had been a guest speaker. She'd talked about the importance of financial literacy for low-income communities, never once revealing that she personally controlled more money than most nations. But the executive chef at the venue had been paid $500,000 to add a tasteless, odorless compound to her meal that would cause cardiac arrest within 72 hours. Daniel learned all of this in Edmund's office, but his hands remained steady as he reviewed the evidence. "What do we do with this information?" "We could go to the authorities," Edmund suggested, but his tone indicated he didn't believe that was the best option. The FBI, the SEC, international financial regulators. But the Basel Group has connections at the highest levels of government. They've bought politicians, judges, regulatory officials. A public investigation could be buried or dismissed. "Then we handle it privately," Daniel decided, but his voice was cold. "Every member of the Basel Group loses everything, their assets, their positions, their reputations. We dismantle them systematically, and we do it in a way that prevents them from ever rebuilding." Edmund studied him for a long moment, but then he nodded. "Your mother would approve, but she'd also warn you about the cost. Revenge can consume you, Daniel. It can turn you into the very thing you're fighting against." "This isn't revenge," Daniel corrected, but his eyes were hard. "This is justice. They murdered my mother because she stood in the way of their greed. I'm going to show them what happens when you target someone who's protected by the very system they tried to corrupt. The campaign against the Basel Group took 6 months, but it was executed with surgical precision. Daniel used his control of the Vandross Fund to systematically expose every member's illegal activities: insider trading, market manipulation, tax evasion, bribery. One by one, they resigned in disgrace or faced criminal prosecution, but the media never connected these seemingly unrelated scandals to a coordinated attack by a single entity. The final member to fall was Gerald Hutchinson, the CEO of Consolidated Global Banking and the man who'd ordered Margaret Harper's assassination. Daniel didn't expose him through public channels, but instead arranged a private meeting in the same Four Seasons ballroom where he'd confronted Richard and Jessica months earlier. Gerald was 72 years old, with white hair and cold blue eyes that had watched empires rise and fall, but he seemed genuinely curious as he sat across from Daniel in an otherwise empty room. "You've been busy, Mr. Harper. Quite impressive for someone so young. Your mother taught you well." "My mother taught me that power should be used responsibly," Daniel replied, but his voice was steady. "You had her killed because you wanted to steal what she'd built. You wanted to control the Vandross Fund and use it to dominate global markets. But you failed, Gerald. You failed completely." Gerald smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I may have failed to acquire the fund, but I succeeded in one respect. Your mother is dead. That was always the primary objective. Remove the obstacle, worry about the inheritance later. But I underestimated you, and I underestimated how quickly you'd learn to wield the power she left you." "Why?" Daniel asked, but he already knew the answer. "Why kill her? Why not just compete legitimately?" "Because legitimate competition would have taken decades," Gerald explained, but his tone suggested he saw nothing wrong with murder as a business strategy. "Your mother controlled assets that could reshape the global economy. She had the power to destroy entire industries or elevate them. The Basel Group spent 30 years trying to neutralize that threat through market manipulation and political pressure, but she was too clever. So we tried a more direct approach." Daniel pulled out a folder and slid it across the table, but Gerald didn't open it. "That's every piece of evidence linking you to my mother's murder. The money trail, the communications with Trevor Morrison, the payment to the chef. It's enough to put you in prison for life, but I'm not going to the authorities." Gerald raised an eyebrow, but he seemed intrigued rather than relieved. "Then what do you want?" "I want you to disappear," Daniel said simply, but his eyes were cold. "Resign from Consolidated Global Banking, liquidate your assets, transfer every dollar you own to a fund I've established for victims of financial crimes, then leave the country and never come back. If you do this quietly, I won't release the evidence. If you refuse, I'll make sure every news outlet in the world knows what you did." Gerald considered this for a long moment, but then he laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You're giving me a choice. How generous. Your mother would have simply destroyed me without offering terms." "My mother believed in justice," Daniel corrected, but his voice was firm. "I believe in second chances, even for people who don't deserve them. You have 24 hours to decide, Gerald. Choose wisely." 22 hours later, Gerald Hutchinson resigned from his position, citing health concerns, but financial analysts noted that he'd liquidated his entire investment portfolio, worth approximately $3.4 billion, and donated it to an unnamed charitable foundation. By the end of the week, he'd relocated to a remote village in New Zealand, where he lived in a modest cottage with no internet and no phone. Daniel never heard from him again, but Edmund assured him that the final member of the Basel Group had been neutralized. "It's over," the lawyer said, but his expression suggested relief mixed with exhaustion. "Your mother's death has been avenged, and the conspiracy that targeted her has been dismantled. Now you can focus on what really matters, building the legacy she intended." But Daniel's thoughts kept returning to Jessica, who'd reached out via email 2 months after the gala. The message was simple: "I made a terrible mistake. I'm sorry, Daniel. I hope you can forgive me someday." He never responded, but not out of cruelty. He simply had nothing to say. Jessica had made her choice based on what she thought she wanted, and now she was living with the consequences. Richard Caldwell had disappeared after his firm collapsed, rumored to be working as a used car salesman in Arizona under an assumed name. But Daniel didn't waste energy tracking him down. Instead, he focused on implementing his mother's vision. The Vandross Fund would operate in perpetuity, investing in projects that improved lives rather than simply generating returns. Renewable energy initiatives in Africa, medical research for diseases that pharmaceutical companies ignored because they weren't profitable, educational programs in communities that had been systematically underserved for generations. A year after his mother's death, Daniel stood in the basement office where Margaret had managed her empire, but it looked different now. He'd converted it into a memorial, photographs of his mother throughout her life, awards she'd never publicly accepted, letters from people whose lives had been changed by her quiet philanthropy. On the desk was a framed note she'd written him when he was 10 years old, found among her personal effects. "Daniel, always remember that the measure of a person isn't what they have, but what they give. Love, Mom." Edmund joined him in the basement, but the lawyer's expression was troubled. "We have a problem. A new problem." Daniel turned, but he felt strangely calm. "What kind of problem?" "Someone's been accessing the Vandross Fund's systems, not trying to steal anything, just observing, monitoring transactions, tracking investments. We've traced the intrusion to a server in Singapore, but beyond that, the trail goes cold. Someone knows about the fund, Daniel, and they're studying it carefully." "Another conspiracy?" Daniel asked, but he wasn't surprised. His mother had warned him through Edmund that the kind of power the Vandross Fund represented would always attract predators and opportunists. "Possibly," Edmund admitted, but his voice was cautious. "Or possibly something else. The intrusion is sophisticated but not malicious. It's almost like reconnaissance, someone learning about us before making contact." Daniel considered this, but his mother's training had prepared him for exactly this scenario. Let them watch, let them learn, but make sure they understand that the Vandross Fund isn't a target, it's a force. Anyone who tries to control it will fail. Anyone who tries to destroy it will be destroyed. And anyone who approaches it with good intentions will find an ally. Edmund smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "You sound like your mother." "Good," Daniel replied, but he looked at Margaret's photograph on the wall. She spent 30 years protecting this legacy in secret. The least I can do is protect it openly, with the same dedication she showed. 2 years after Margaret Harper's death, Daniel Harper had become a ghost in Manhattan's financial circles. People knew the name, knew the power, but few had ever met him. He didn't attend galas anymore, didn't seek publicity, didn't court influence. Instead, he worked quietly, just as his mother had, investing in projects that would never generate headlines but would change lives incrementally, persistently, permanently. Jessica had remarried, not to someone wealthy, but to a school teacher she'd met at a community center where she volunteered. Daniel learned this through a mutual friend, but he felt only relief that she'd found happiness through humility rather than greed. Richard Caldwell had indeed become a used car salesman, but he'd also started a blog about financial ethics and the dangers of unchecked ambition. Daniel read it occasionally, surprised to find genuine remorse in Richard's words. As for the mysterious intrusion into the Vandross Fund's systems, it turned out to be a young programmer in Singapore named Maya Chen, but she wasn't a threat. She'd stumbled upon traces of the fund while investigating financial crimes for a non-profit organization, and she'd been trying to understand its scope and purpose. When Daniel finally made contact, offering her a position managing the fund's cybersecurity, she accepted immediately. "Your mother was brilliant," Maya told him during their first meeting, but her voice held genuine admiration. "She built something that shouldn't be possible, a financial system that operates independently of political influence, corporate greed, or individual ego. Most people would have used that power to dominate. She used it to help." "That's the legacy I'm trying to honor," Daniel replied, but he felt the weight of that responsibility every day. "Every decision I make with this fund could affect millions of lives. It's terrifying and humbling in equal measure." "Your mother trusted you with this for a reason," Maya said gently, but her eyes were knowing. "She saw something in you that made her believe you'd use it wisely. Don't second-guess that trust." On the 3rd anniversary of Margaret Harper's death, Daniel returned to Greenwood Cemetery, but he wasn't alone. Edmund was there, and Maya, and a dozen other people who'd come to know Margaret's work through the foundation. They stood around her grave in silence, but Daniel finally spoke, his voice carrying across the quiet morning. "Mom, I hope I'm doing this right. I hope I'm honoring the vision you had and the sacrifices you made. You spent 30 years building something extraordinary while teaching me to be ordinary. But now I understand why. You wanted me to know the value of things before I had the power to buy anything. You wanted me to understand struggle before I had the ability to eliminate it for others. You wanted me to be humble before you gave me a reason to be proud." He paused, but tears were running down his face. "I miss you every day. I miss your advice, your humor, your quiet strength. But I also feel you in everything I do with the fund. Every investment, every project, every decision. I ask myself what you would do, and somehow I always know the answer." The wind picked up, rustling through the cemetery trees, but Daniel took it as a sign that his mother was listening. He placed a single white rose on her grave, then walked away with the others, ready to continue the work that would define the rest of his life. The Vandross Fund would grow over the years, not in accumulated wealth, but in impact. 30 years after Margaret's death, when Daniel was himself an old man with silver hair and tired eyes, a historian would interview him for a book about secret philanthropy. The historian would ask, "Do you ever regret the choices you made? Do you wonder what your life would have been like if your mother had been honest from the beginning?" Daniel would consider the question carefully, but his answer would be simple. "My mother gave me 2 gifts. The first was $50 trillion and the power to change the world. The second was the wisdom to know that the money meant nothing without purpose, that power without integrity was just tyranny in expensive clothes. I wouldn't trade either gift for anything, but the second one was infinitely more valuable than the first." And in that moment, the historian would understand that Margaret Harper's greatest legacy wasn't the fund she'd built or the wealth she'd accumulated, but the son she'd raised to be worthy of both. Jessica would read that book years later, long after Daniel had passed away and the Vandross Fund had become a subject of academic study and policy debates. But she would close it with tears in her eyes and a final understanding of what she'd lost when she chose Richard's promises over Daniel's quiet devotion. But by then, it would be far too late to apologize, far too late to make amends, far too late to do anything except live with the knowledge that she'd once been married to the most powerful man in the world and had thrown it away for a broker's empty promises and a diamond ring. The shock of what Daniel did, not just to Richard, not just to the Basel Group, but to the entire architecture of global finance by continuing his mother's work with even greater dedication, would ripple through generations, but it would always be discussed in whispers rather than headlines, in private conversations rather than public forums, because true power, as Margaret Harper had taught her son, was never about recognition or fame. It was about impact. It was about legacy. It was about changing the world so fundamentally that people felt the effects without ever knowing the source. And Daniel Harper, the quiet man who'd been underestimated by his wife, dismissed by his boss, and tested by his mother's impossible inheritance, had learned that lesson perfectly. 15 years had passed since Daniel Harper stood at his mother's grave and made his promise, but the morning he received the envelope marked "Final Instructions to be opened upon completion" felt like stepping back in time. Edmund Cross had died 3 months earlier at the age of 82, but his law firm had continued executing his final wishes with precision that suggested the old lawyer had planned every detail years in advance. Daniel sat in his penthouse office. He'd finally allowed himself this one luxury after Maya had insisted he needed a proper workspace. But the view of Manhattan meant nothing as he broke the wax seal on the envelope. Inside was a letter in Edmund's distinctive handwriting, but also a USB drive and a photograph he'd never seen before. His mother, no more than 25 years old, sitting across from a younger Edmund in what appeared to be a cafe in Geneva. The letter began without preamble. "Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I've fulfilled my promise to your mother and guided you through the most dangerous years of your inheritance. But it also means you're ready for the final truth. The truth Margaret made me swear I'd reveal only after you'd proven yourself worthy not just of the money, but of the mission. Your mother didn't create the Vandross Fund, Daniel. She inherited it." Daniel's hands tightened on the paper, but he kept reading. The fund was established in 1847 by a woman named Charlotte Vandross, your mother's great-great-great-grandmother, but Charlotte wasn't a banker or an heiress. She was a former slave who escaped to Switzerland and built a fortune through intelligence, courage, and an understanding of financial systems that was decades ahead of her time. She created the fund with a single purpose: to accumulate enough wealth to systematically dismantle the economic systems that perpetuated slavery, oppression, and inequality. For 170 years, the Vandross Fund has been passed down through the women in your family, but always in secret, always with the same mission. Your mother was the seventh guardian. You are the eighth. And according to Charlotte's original charter, which I have included on the USB drive, the fund must continue until its mission is complete, until the economic systems that enable exploitation have been fundamentally transformed. Your mother chose you despite the tradition of female succession because she believed you embodied the values Charlotte had established: humility, integrity, compassion, and an unwillingness to use power for personal gain. But she also chose you because the mission was entering its most dangerous phase. The Basel Group wasn't the first conspiracy to target the fund, and it won't be the last. But what you need to understand, Daniel, is that the fund itself is now large enough to accomplish Charlotte's original mission. You have the resources to restructure global financial systems, to redistribute wealth on a scale that could eliminate poverty, to create an economic framework based on equity rather than exploitation. But your mother believed that doing so too quickly would cause chaos, wars, revolutions, suffering that would dwarf any good the fund could accomplish. So she developed a 50-year implementation plan, which you'll find on the USB drive, but she also left you with a choice. You can follow her plan exactly, implementing changes gradually and carefully, or you can accelerate the timeline if you believe the world is ready for more dramatic transformation. Or you can maintain the status quo, continuing to help incrementally while waiting for a future generation to complete the mission. Your mother trusted you to make this decision, Daniel. But she also wanted you to know that whatever you choose, you'll have support. The USB drive contains contacts for 17 other secret funds, similar to ours, other families, other legacies, other guardians who've been working toward the same goals for generations. They've been waiting for the Vandross Fund to reach critical mass, and now it has. Together you have the power to reshape human civilization, but that power comes with responsibility that would crush most people. Your mother believed you were strong enough to bear it. I came to agree with her, but I also want you to know that if you choose to pass this burden to someone else, to Maya, perhaps, or to a future heir, no one would judge you. You've already done more than Charlotte could have dreamed possible. The choice, as always, is yours. With respect and admiration, Edmund Cross Daniel set down the letter, but his hands were shaking. He inserted the USB drive into his computer and spent the next 6 hours reviewing files that rewrote everything he thought he understood about his family, his inheritance, and his purpose. Charlotte Vandross had escaped slavery in 1844, but she'd carried with her something more valuable than freedom: documentation of financial transactions between European banks and American plantation owners. She'd used that information to blackmail, manipulate, and strategically invest until she'd accumulated enough capital to start destabilizing the economic systems that supported slavery. By the time the Civil War began, Charlotte had quietly financed abolitionists, supported the Underground Railroad, and helped create financial pressure that made slavery economically unsustainable. But she hadn't stopped there, because she understood that slavery was just one manifestation of a deeper problem: economic systems designed to concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a few while exploiting the many. So she'd created the Vandross Fund with instructions that it should grow and operate in secret until it became powerful enough to fundamentally restructure how money worked. 170 years later, Daniel Harper held that power in his hands, but the weight of it was crushing. He called Maya into his office, but when she arrived and saw his expression, she closed the door and sat down without speaking. "My mother left me a choice," Daniel said finally, but his voice was hollow. "Actually, Charlotte Vandross left me a choice 170 years ago. I can change everything, Maya. I can eliminate poverty. I can redistribute wealth on a scale that would make current economic inequality impossible. I can create a world where everyone has enough, but no one has obscene excess." Maya waited, but her eyes were knowing. But I'd be imposing my vision of fairness on billions of people who might disagree," Daniel continued, but he was thinking out loud now. "I'd be acting as a dictator, even a benevolent one. I'd be deciding what the world should look like, without any democratic mandate, without any accountability except to myself and Charlotte's 170-year-old vision." "Your mother faced this same choice," Maya said gently, but her voice was firm. "She chose gradual change because she believed people needed time to adapt. But she also lived through decades of watching inequality grow worse, watching systems she could have dismantled cause immeasurable suffering. Do you think she made the right choice?" Daniel looked at the photograph of his mother with young Edmund, but he realized he'd never know what she truly thought. "I think she made the choice she could live with. The question is, what choice I can live with." He spent 3 months consulting with the other guardians Edmund had mentioned, families in Japan, Brazil, Nigeria, India, and a dozen other nations who'd been working towards similar goals through different methods. Some advocated for immediate, dramatic action. Others counseled patience. But all of them deferred to Daniel because the Vandross Fund was, by far, the largest and most influential. The decision came to him not through careful analysis or rational deliberation, but through a conversation with an unexpected source: Jessica. She'd reached out after reading Edmund's obituary, but her email was different from the apologetic message she'd sent years earlier. This one was simple. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I have something to say that I think you need to hear. Can we meet? Daniel agreed, but more out of curiosity than any lingering feelings. They met at a small cafe in Brooklyn, neutral territory, far from Manhattan's financial district. But Jessica looked different. Older, certainly, but also more grounded. The desperate hunger for luxury and status that had defined their marriage was gone, replaced by something that looked like hard-won peace. I'm not here to apologize again, Jessica said after they'd ordered coffee, but her voice was steady. You've heard that enough? I'm here to tell you something I learned after our divorce, something I think might help you. Daniel waited, but he was genuinely curious now. After Richard's firm collapsed and we broke up, I was lost, Jessica continued, but she wasn't looking for sympathy. I'd built my entire identity around wealth and status, and suddenly I had neither. I was working as a receptionist, living in a studio apartment, eating ramen for dinner, and I was miserable. But not because I was poor. I was miserable because I finally had to confront who I actually was without the costume of expensive clothes and fancy restaurants. She paused to sip her coffee, but her eyes never left Daniel's face. It took me 3 years of therapy to understand what I should have known all along. Happiness doesn't come from having more, it comes from being enough. I'm remarried now to a good man who makes a teacher's salary, and I'm happier than I ever was with you or Richard. Not because David is better than you, he's not, and I know that, but because I finally learned to be content with enough. Daniel absorbed this, but he wasn't sure how it related to his current dilemma. Why are you telling me this? Because I read about your mother, Jessica explained, but her voice was gentle. I read about the foundation you've been running, about the projects you've funded, about the lives you've changed. And I realized that you're facing a choice I never understood when we were married. When is enough? Enough. When do you stop trying to save everyone and accept that some problems are too big for one person to solve, even if that person has $50 trillion? She leaned forward, but her expression was earnest. I'm not saying don't help people, Daniel. I'm saying don't destroy yourself trying to fix everything. Your mother understood that. She could have restructured the global economy, but she chose not to because she understood that some changes need to come from people themselves, not be imposed by a secret guardian with unlimited resources. Daniel sat back in his chair, but Jessica's words had crystallized something he'd been struggling to articulate. You're saying I should accept the limitations of what I can do. I'm saying you should accept that you're human, Jessica corrected, but she smiled sadly. You're not God, Daniel, even if you have godlike resources. You're a man who inherited an impossible responsibility, and you're doing your best. But at some point, you have to trust that other people can solve their own problems, or at least learn from their own mistakes. They talked for another hour, but when Daniel left the cafe, he felt lighter than he had in months. Jessica's perspective, earned through her own failures and hard-won wisdom, had given him the clarity he needed. He spent the next week drafting a document that would guide the Vandross Fund for the next century, but it wasn't his mother's 50-year implementation plan, and it wasn't Charlotte's vision of complete economic restructuring. Instead, it was something new, a framework for supporting systemic change while respecting human agency. The Vandross Fund would continue investing in projects that created opportunity rather than dependency. It would support education, healthcare, renewable energy, and financial literacy programs that empowered people to improve their own circumstances. It would work with the other Guardian funds to gradually reshape economic systems toward greater equity, but always in ways that allowed communities to maintain agency and self-determination. And most importantly, it would remain secret, because Daniel had finally understood what his mother and Charlotte had known all along. The most dangerous thing about unlimited wealth wasn't how it corrupted the person who held it, but how it removed the natural consequences that taught people to make better decisions. Maya approved the new framework, but she added one crucial element: a succession plan that didn't rely on bloodline or tradition. Charlotte started this and your mother continued it, but you need to ensure it outlasts family lines. The fund should be inherited by whoever demonstrates the values it was built to support, regardless of whether they're related to you. Daniel agreed, but he also established a council of guardians who would collectively oversee the fund after his death. Not one person bearing the full weight, but a group sharing the responsibility. He invited Maya to chair the council, but he also recruited thoughtful leaders from around the world who understood both the power and the limitations of wealth. 20 years after Edmund's final letter, Daniel Harper stood at Charlotte Vandross's grave in Geneva, a simple headstone that bore only her name and dates, with no mention of the empire she'd built. He'd made this pilgrimage every year since learning the full truth, but this visit felt different because he'd finally made peace with his role. "I didn't follow your plan exactly," he told Charlotte's memory, but his voice was calm. "I didn't reshape the world the way you envisioned, but I did continue the mission, just more slowly and carefully than you might have wanted. I chose to trust that humanity could evolve without being forced, that people could learn equity without having it imposed. I hope that's enough. I hope you'd understand." The Swiss wind carried his words away, but Daniel felt no need for an answer. He'd spent 20 years using the Vandross Fund to create opportunities, support innovations, and carefully nudge financial systems toward greater fairness. But he'd done so while accepting that real change took generations, not years. The world was better than when he'd inherited the fund, but it wasn't perfect. Poverty still existed, inequality still persisted, exploitation still occurred. But Daniel had learned to measure success not by problems solved, but by trajectories changed. More children had access to education. More communities had clean water. More innovations were focused on human needs rather than pure profit. The trend lines were moving in the right direction, even if the pace felt glacial. On his 75th birthday, Daniel formally transferred leadership of the Vandross Fund to the Guardian Council, but he remained as an advisor. Maya had become the de facto leader, but she shared decisions with representatives from all 17 Guardian funds that Edmund had connected him to. Together, they managed combined assets exceeding $200 trillion, but they wielded that power with the kind of restraint Daniel had learned from his mother's example and Charlotte's legacy. Jessica attended his birthday celebration. They'd maintained a cordial friendship over the years, but so did dozens of people whose lives had been changed by projects the Vandross Fund supported. Engineers who'd developed affordable water purification systems, doctors who'd created low-cost medical devices, educators who'd pioneered new teaching methods. They didn't know they were celebrating a man who could have bought countries, but they knew they were celebrating someone who'd believed in their work when no one else would. Late that evening, as guests were leaving, Maya pulled Daniel aside. "I found something in your mother's papers that I think you should see. It's dated the day before she died." The letter was short but written in Margaret's steady handwriting. "Daniel, if you're reading this after I'm gone, it means Edmund did his job, and you've learned the full truth about the Vandross Fund and Charlotte's legacy. I know this revelation has probably caused you doubt, confusion, perhaps even anger that I kept so much from you for so long. But I want you to know that every decision I made, every secret I kept, every test I put you through was because I believed in you. not because of your intelligence or your integrity, though you have both in abundance. I believed in you because you've always understood something that Charlotte understood, something that most people with power forget, that true strength isn't dominating others, it's empowering them. You'll face impossible choices, my son. You'll be tempted to use the fund's resources to solve problems quickly rather than carefully. You'll see suffering you could alleviate immediately if you just imposed solutions. But I'm asking you to resist that temptation because lasting change comes from within communities, not from external forces, no matter how well-intentioned. Charlotte Vandross spent 170 years building this fund, and I spent 30 years managing it, but our work was just preparation. You are the one who will determine whether the Vandross Fund becomes a force for genuine transformation or just another tool of benevolent tyranny. I trust you to choose wisely, but I also want you to know that I'll always be proud of you, regardless of what you decide. You've already become the kind of man Charlotte hoped would eventually inherit her legacy, humble enough to doubt yourself, strong enough to bear impossible responsibility, and wise enough to know the difference between helping and controlling. I love you, Daniel. I always have. Even when I was testing you, especially when I was testing you. Mom Daniel read the letter 3 times, but tears were streaming down his face. By the end, his mother had known he would struggle with this burden, but she'd also known he was capable of bearing it. That faith, more than the money or the power or the legacy, was the true inheritance she'd left him. He looked at Maya, who was watching him with concern and understanding. She knew I'd doubt myself. She knew you'd care enough to doubt yourself, Maya corrected gently, but her voice was firm. People who never doubt themselves are the ones who cause the most harm. Your mother understood that the best guardians are the ones who question whether they should be guardians at all. That night, Daniel returned to his penthouse, but instead of reviewing financial reports or strategic plans, he simply sat by the window and watched Manhattan's lights stretch toward the horizon. Somewhere in this city were people struggling to pay rent, working multiple jobs, wondering if they'd ever achieve financial security. The Vandross Fund couldn't solve all their problems, but it could create conditions where solutions became possible. And maybe, Daniel thought as he finally drifted toward sleep, that was enough. Not perfect, not immediate, not miraculous, but enough. Charlotte Vandross had started a 170-year mission to transform economic systems, but she'd done so with patience born from understanding that real change outlasted lifetimes. Daniel would continue that mission, but he would do so with the wisdom his mother had spent 30 years teaching him. That power without patience was just violence, that wealth without purpose was just hoarding, and that the greatest legacy wasn't what you accumulated, but what you empowered others to achieve. The Vandross Fund would endure long after Daniel Harper was gone, but its greatest success wouldn't be measured in dollars or projects or lives changed. It would be measured in whether humanity eventually learned to build economic systems based on Charlotte's vision, systems where wealth served people rather than people serving wealth. And as Daniel finally closed his eyes, he felt his mother's presence one last time, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a feeling of absolute certainty. He was doing exactly what he was meant to do, exactly how it needed to be done. The shock of what Daniel did wasn't in how he used his inheritance, but in how he chose not to use it, restraining impossible power in service of a higher principle, trusting humanity to eventually rise to its better nature rather than forcing it to do so. And that restraint, born from love and wisdom passed down through generations, was the true revolution Charlotte Vandross had started 170 years earlier. It just took the right guardian to finally understand it.